Today we'll be talking about the early modern period in world history, a period that runs roughly 1450 to roughly 1750, the next period after the great post-classical millennium. The period warrants two comments by way of general introduction. First, it's obviously fairly short. We've been dealing with 1500 years for the classical period, 1000 years for the post-classical, and now we're talking about 300. And the reasons for this are probably threefold, and I won't even pretend to say which is most important. First of all, change may have speeded up. That's a modern impression, and maybe it's true. I'm honestly not sure, worth thinking about. Second, as we get closer to the present, we know more. There are more abundant records. That's pretty obvious, but it also helps historians feed larger sections of their treatments. And third, I think quite legitimately, you need to spend more time on periods that are closer to the present day because inevitably they will have even more influence on current patterns of activity. These connections we'll be working on through the discussions from this point onward, but they're perfectly legitimate. This is a perfectly honest, indeed useful employment of historical analysis. The period begins 1450 or so. We talked last time about some of the components that were changing in the world in 1450, including the new European expeditions, the significant changes in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, the Chinese decision, which helped set the stage for new activity as well. Some historians would urge maybe 1500's a bit better date. By 1500, it was becoming clear that the Europeans had arrived in the Americas and were actually going to utilize their arrival to introduce significant changes. That obviously was not even on the horizon clearly in 1450. And also by 1500, the Ottoman Empire had expanded from its hold in southwestern Europe, northeastern Middle East, to include victories over Egyptian forces that extended the Ottoman Empire through much of the Arab world, not all of it, but much of it, including portions of North Africa, Egypt obviously front and center. So 1450, 1500 gets things started. 1750 at the other end is frankly a date of convenience. It really is used mainly to say, well, it's around this time that things are going to be changing because of the impact of European industrialization. Not an entirely satisfactory decision. We'll have to talk about it when we talk about the next period in world history. This is an unusual case in which the boundaries of a period at the end are frankly pretty vague. But let's be honest, that's the way it's usually done. Early modern, obviously, is meant to be revealing. It's not quite modern, hence early, but it's a lot more recognizable in terms of our world today than the post-classical was. It's a term that was long used in European history. I don't think it's a distortion to use it in world history, but we need to recognize what some of the implications are. The second general comment about the early modern period is really a warning. This is where many well-intentioned world history educational programs go off the rails. For example, the California state system. California established elegant parameters for world history up to 1450. Interesting treatments of Islam, of Asia, of Africa, etc. But then in 1450, the world becomes Europe. And two things happen. One, the expansion of European power, which is undeniable, becomes the central theme so that everything is organized around how societies were reached by Europe, how they reacted to Europe as though they had no independent volition, no independent background, and that just oversimplifies and distorts. The second thing that happens is European history is suddenly given a richness. We're indulging ourselves in looking at the glories of changes in the West as if nothing else were going on elsewhere, as if these developments need to receive a degree of attention that simply distracts from the continued complexity of the world as a whole. So in dealing with the early modern period, we must recognize that the power of Western Europe in the world did increase. That's a legitimate major change. We must recognize that the nature of the West itself was significantly transformed in ways that were obviously important in the West and would have implications for other regions. But we must keep balance. I think it's easy to do, but we need to keep the warning in mind. Europe did not run the world in 1750. Many societies continued to act in great independence of Europe. Important developments continued to occur that had very little to do with Europe one way or the other. The world continued to be complicated. The world continued to operate along several parallel lines. In establishing a new period, as we discussed when we talked about the introduction of the post-classical period, we need not only to have a set of dates, here 1450 or so, 1750 or so, we also have to have a fairly clear sense that the themes that had previously predominated have lost some force. And this is fairly actually easy to state. The post-classical period, lots of things going on. The post-classical period was defined above all by a clear expansion in the geographical range and number of civilizations, by the impact of the world religions, and by the establishment of a world network connecting different parts of Africa, Asia, and Europe. The theme of expansion of civilization obviously can continue to be played in the early modern period, but because the main contours of the civilization zones are pretty well established, particularly outside of the Americas, it's no longer a dominant organizing principle. World religions did continue to expand. Islam is still moving into Southeast Asia, and obviously the Ottoman conquests introduced the possibility of a significant Muslim minority in Southeastern Europe as well. Christianity would expand hugely in the Americas during the early modern period, although not quite as rapidly as some priests and monks had hoped. But for the world as a whole, the religious map was pretty well set, and the big impact of world religions really had come and gone in terms of a major innovative force. Their sustaining power is still there. The world network simply gets transformed. It's still an operative concept, but it gets transformed because of the inclusion of the Americas. So the world network was an intense interrelationship among different societies in what we might conveniently call the old world. The new world economy, which we'll explore more fully next time, the new world economy is literally global. And that's a huge change. Indeed, and now we turn to the most important part, what are the new themes? Indeed, the most important single development in the early modern period is the intensification of interregional trade connections and the inclusion of the Americas, and at the very end of the period, the inclusion also of Pacific Oceania in these global trade patterns. Huge development, pretty obvious, but the implications are immense. Other changes, other new themes include, and these are what we're going to explore during the balance of our discussion today, other new changes include the new power relationship of the West in the world. Didn't happen overnight. It has to be seen as gradual, but it did occur. The biological exchanges that resulted from European and African contact with the Americas. And finally, the explosion, no pun intended, of gunpowder empires, a point that relates to the expansion of Europe but needs separate attention. First, the expansion of Europe. This can be very simply summed up, and there's a nice book by Carla Cipolla precisely along these lines, as gun sales and empires. By the 15th century, Europeans had adapted Chinese explosive powder into guns and particularly cannon. They benefited, interestingly, from the fact that well before the advent of Chinese explosive powder in Europe, Europeans were already familiar with heavy metal casting, interestingly for the purpose of making church bells. Now, nobody sat around when church bells were being developed saying, I think several centuries from now this will make a great weapon. But the fact is, another bit of dumb luck. Europeans were able to transfer this technology to the casting of bronze and iron cannon. Sails came from adaptations of Arab shipping. Europeans learned how to make more effective ocean-going vessels. They stopped depending on galley slaves to row through the Mediterranean, and these new vessels proved to be particularly successful in navigating the waters of the Atlantic and then the Pacific. Along with guns and sails came, of course, the increasing utilization of navigational devices, most of which the Europeans had borrowed from elsewhere, the compass, etc., and the Europeans were off and running.